Welcome to another study from the book of Acts. Today, our subject is calling. Uh, any one of us who have answered the call of God in our life in our conversion experience, remember that. But those of us who have been in ministry or are in ministry realize that our calling is something we never forget. This coming December will be my 61st anniversary as an ordained minister. But in the spring, when I was 16 years of age, I answered God's call. And then in the fall or the winter of my 18th birthday, I began as a pastor. I was ordained then. So calling is a very important part of our life. Before I proceed, let me just make a suggestion to you. I talk slow, and I've discovered that I even talk slower now for various reasons. And what I do when I'm listening to this text is that I will uh, increase my speed. I listen a lot quicker, I guess, better than I speak. And I've discovered that by increasing the speed by a quarter, that is, make it 1.25 in your listening speed, it's a more pleasant experience. I still fall asleep when I'm listening to myself, but nonetheless, it might be more of a pleasurable experience if you do the same. This is a pivotal chapter in the book of Acts. This is where we see Peter and John have been the principal leaders up until now. They will make a brief appearance in this chapter, not in this lesson, but the next lesson. They will make excuse me, they will make an appearance now, but they will sort of go off the scene in the next lesson, and it becomes then Paul, who is the one who will be the leading character in the remaining book of Acts after he answers this call. It's a pivotal book. In the next lesson, we will spend more time talking about the pivotal nature of the book. I want first to introduce you to some people and to places. Of course, our main character in this narrative is the apostle himself, whose name up until this time is Saul. And then after his conversion experience, his name is changed from Saul to Paul. Now, as I speak, you'll discover that I will confuse those and I'll say Paul, Saul, Paul, Saul. But understand that I know that he was Saul up until his conversion. Then he became Paul, and he is the main character that's being introduced for the remainder part of the book of Acts. But some other principal players that you need to know. First is Ananias. Ananias was a disciple who lived in Damascus, and he had to go to the street called Straight, which is a picture at the top there. And he was called upon in a vision to go to the apostle who was living in the house of Judas. I believe it was Judas. And as a result of being in that house, he was directed there where he laid hands on Saul, and he soon baptized him. Now, I'm surprised at how little attention is given to the baptism of Saul, because he was a man on his way to destroy the people of the way, that is, the disciples, the followers of Christ. And I would have gathered that his baptism would have been an important event, but nonetheless, not a lot of attention is given to that. So Ananias is principal player in the story. But there are others as well. Of course, Damascus is the destination. The street called Straight is where he was on his way to move into that particular region to find the apostle himself. I'm going to make it a more pleasant experience for you by reducing my uh, presence so that you won't have to look at me all the time. Again, there are other people and other places. For me, it's important that we know the characters and we know the people, we know the places. Uh, in this particular picture, we see that this is a characterization of the apostle on his knees in one of the miracles that we'll talk about later. And this is Tabitha. Also, in the Greek language, she is known as Dorcas. She lives in the city of Joppa, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, on the east coast of the Mediterranean, near another city that we'll hear about called Lydda. And we'll talk more about that. But one of the characters, Dorcas. But then also, uh, not to be confused with Ananias, this is Aeneas, who was a paralytic that was healed by Peter, who makes that brief appearance in this chapter and gives witness to the power of God through that miracle. There are other characters and there are other places, but a little more about Damascus. Damascus, this is an old city. This was taken from Bible places, which I have used a lot of their pictures, and you'll see that notification at the bottom of the picture. But it's an old picture of Damascus. It was a city in Paul's day, but it's a city today, and it's one that you could make if you travel from Jerusalem, as did Paul on this occasion. He traveled 135 miles across some pretty rough terrain. And you see in the picture on the right that he made that trip. It was a 5 to 7 day trip. And his purpose in making this trip was to be a destructive force to the people of the way, that is, followers of Christ. And as he made that journey up that road, not really a road that is designated exactly as it was in that day, but we know that this is a similar route that he would have taken. It changed his life forever. He probably traveled through some beautiful sections in if you follow the mountain north up the edge of the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and above the Mediterranean Sea, there is a turn eastward. He goes near Mount Hermon, which is the mountain from which the waters come that feed into the Mediterranean and down into the Dead Sea. Apparently, in those days, as they travel near water sources and in the coolest places that they could find. So this is the way he traveled. And of course, this is the place where Paul was praying after that experience. And Ananias was called upon to go to this place in order to find Saul, who became Paul. Now, Paul's hometown was in Cilicia, which is on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, and in region areas where Paul will travel on his missionary journeys, and we'll see that as the text unfolds. You can see the various ways Cyprus is a prominent island that Paul encounters on one of his journeys. And so he travels back through some area that would be considered home area. He also is sent back there immediately after he gets into real trouble in order to take a break from all that was happening. On the right, you see a picture that comes from Bible places depicting what remains as remains of his home. I found in my studies, again, all of my studies about the places have come from videos and from pictures. I've never been to this region of the Holy Land. The only place that I have been where Paul lived and traveled was in Rome, the country of Rome, but I did not at the time of travel there visit any of the known places of where Paul traveled. That's to my detriment that I've not done that. But there are many ways, even though we do not physically go to these places, there are many ways to travel there, even as we're doing right now. Saul had an encounter with Jesus. He was blinded by the light, uh, and and he was blinded. Let me go back to that. Excuse me. Go back. He was blinded by the light. He heard a voice, and it was the voice of Jesus. And in that encounter, his life was changed forever for the good. Immediately afterwards, again, I mentioned his baptism, his sight was restored. He began preaching in the synagogues. As a result of that, he immediately had hostile relationship with the uh, Jewish people. Immediately, his allies, when he started, became his enemy, and those that were his enemy, the Christians, became his allies. That's how quick his experience changed his life. And soon after he starts his preaching, those who he set out to kill became those who rescued him and enabled him to escape from the city of Damascus and go back to Jerusalem. Uh, it, our conversion experience makes that kind of difference in our life. I see that I'm going to have a problem reading some of my text, so bear with me. Paul was breathing out threatenings and murderous thoughts as he traveled. He was soon arrested. He was had those threats, and he was headed out to destroy. He had papers in hand to destroy people, and he had even gotten the authority from the high priest. And he was on his way to uh, destroy the people of the way. That is a term that is often used to describe disciples of Christ, followers of Christ, and he was on his way to do just that, to destroy them. And as he traveled near Damascus, he suddenly saw that light. He fell to the ground. He heard a voice, and he asked the question, Saul, or the question, he heard the voice asking this question, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And his answer is, who are you, Lord? And the Lord then responded to him in a way that he clearly understood. Verse 5, on the Damascus road, Paul says, who are you, Lord? And then he responds, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. And this is the identification of Jesus. That is one of the focus points that we will repeat at the end of this for those of you who are going to teach this in your lesson series on Acts. He says, I am Jesus. He identifies himself. And we need to understand that all that we do is because of Jesus. He is the one that we live for. He is the one that we will be on mission for. He is the one that we give our worship and allegiance to. And when we do that, we find the most out of this life and get the most. We find the richest way, pathway to finding purpose and meaning in our life on earth. And then we are given the promise to live eternally with him in heaven. Then he was given instructions. He says, but get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. A lot of advanced planning is occurring behind the scenes, and those advanced plans will unfold as we make our journey through this text. Verse 7 reveals how things around us are influenced by our experience. There were men traveling with him, and the scriptures tell us as they were traveling with him, they stood speechless, hearing a sound, but seeing no one. And that itself, we would say, is rather spooky. Now, we see the trees move and we hear the wind, but we know the wind is what is moving the trees. But these men heard a sound, but they saw no one. So they were speechless, frightened. But then Paul responds to that. Verse 8, he got up from the ground and realized, though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And so they took him by the hand and led him into Damascus. I don't know how far out of town he was, but we know he was near there. I don't know how long it took, but if you have ever been where you could not see and someone was leading you, particularly in a strange place, that is itself a frightening experience. But he could see nothing. Now, of course, that can be spoken to in our world. There are many things that our eyes are open that we do not see, as it was in the days of the Old Testament when God worked in the lives of the people of Egypt and God's people in bondage. Plagues came, but they could not see that these plagues, all of these things that God was bringing upon them, was for them to listen and obey Him. And of course, throughout the narrative of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, we continue to see story after story of people who had their eyes open. They were seeing, but they were not understanding that it was God who was speaking through those events. Well, they took him by the hand and they led him into Damascus. He was there, according to verse 9, he was there for 3 days. I mean, he was blind for 3 days, and he even fasted during that time and prayed, as we will see in the text. So he made that trip into Damascus. He went to the house that God had arranged for him to go to in the house of Judas, which was on that street called Straight. We'll see another visual image or another picture of that. There was the disciple that I introduced to you earlier, Ananias, and he should not be confused with Aeneas that we will soon meet, but it was Ananias, and the Lord had spoken to him in a vision. He was a follower of Christ. He was a person of the way, and God had a special mission for him. And when he appeared to Ananias, he said, "Here I am, Lord." And he said to Ananias, now he had spoken to Paul on the Damascus Road. Now he is speaking to his servant. And he says, now in verse 11, I want you to get up and go to the street called Straight. We don't know exactly where Ananias lived, but he apparently knew the destination. He said, I want you to go to the house of Judas. And we don't know anything about Judas. You see that picture of the street that his house was on, and Judas was living there. And he said, when you knock on the door, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, since he is praying there. Apparently, Judas must have been a disciple as well. We don't know that by the text, but I would presume that. Could be wrong, but in my assumption, he was a person of the way. And in a vision, even Paul has a vision. And that vision was that he saw a man named Ananias coming in and placing his hand on him so that he might regain his sight. So God was working in the Apostle Paul, but also working in the life of Ananias, and both of them together were going to accomplish the plan God had from the beginning. Verse 13, Lord, Ananias answered, I've heard from many people about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. So Ananias was now responding and reacting out of fear because he had heard about Saul of Tarsus. He knew that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He knew that he had studied at the feet of Gamaliel and gone to his school and trained, and he was high up in the Pharisaical system, and he had a mission of destroying the work of God. So he was afraid because he knew that he was the target, that Saul was coming to annihilate. And so these things were troubling him. And verse 14 reveals, and he has authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name. And so, but then he is given a revelation in verse 15. For the Lord said to him, go, for this man is my chosen instrument to take my name to Gentiles, kings, and Israelites. Now, this is going to be the second portion of the focus text. Maybe I think this is the last portion that helps us to understand the purpose of all of this taking place, because Saul was the instrument that God was going to use to carry the message from a Hebrew to a Gentile. And Paul was not equipped emotionally, otherwise. Gentiles have been a subject of his hate, and particularly those who now were following Christ that double his hate for them. And now God is going to change his heart, and he is going to be the one to carry that message. Verse 16 reveals that Saul's following Christ, that is, responding to the call, comes with a price, because he will, upon those conversations in the synagogues and in the streets with the Jews, the leaders of the Jewish movement, are going to cause him great harm, and he's going to have to flee for his life. So that is how this is unfolded. As a result of Saul responding and doing and being obedient to Christ, he grew stronger as he witnessed, but also he confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus as he proved that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, proving is an important part of our journey. We have evidence to present the gospel to the world. We are not living as people of the gaps. That is, when we don't have an answer, we'll say, well, it's because of God. There's good evidence. And here, Paul, soon after his conversion, is giving the evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. As a result, that brought the Jews even more hostility from them. And after many days had passed, the Jews conspired to kill him. Again, this reflects our day, people who have risen to the height politically, or in the social life, or in the movie and entertainment field, sports field, economic field, educational field. People who have risen to the top, many topple from their tower of material concepts by making some moral or immoral decision, or even other things that cause them to spiral to the bottom. And I'm convinced that those who promote those who are rising to the top are the same people who celebrate their fall from the top, and they follow the ups and downs, and they seem to gain favor on the rising and the falling of people. So here, these Jews who had been his allies are now his enemies, and those who were his enemies are now his allies. Paul's life has completely changed. And so the Jews were wanting to kill him. He is now the hunted rather than the hunter. He is now the target rather than the shooter. He is now the victim rather than the strength. He is now the one who is sought to be killed. But Paul learned about this plot, verse 24, and they were watching him. They were watching the gates. As you recall, in those ancient days, the city gate was where people came and went. Someone was always there guarding that. And so they guarded the gate with the intention to kill Paul if they saw him. But then the disciples, that is, those whom Paul was coming to destroy, now are the very ones that became his savior, and they let him down by night over the wall in a large basket through the wall, and he was given an escape route. So he then left and made his route or his return home. Remember, this took 5 to 7 days. But when he returned to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples. Can you imagine what they knew about Saul and how his reputation preceded him? They were afraid of him for good reason. And now he wants to come and join in with them. And I would have been skeptical as well. But this helps us to see how important it is to have somebody to be our witness or to be sometimes a person to introduce us to those who are suspicious of us. I did not mention Barnabas among those that I introduced earlier in the introduction, but now Barnabas, whose name means son of consolation or comfort, will be prominent in Paul's mission journeys, etc. He is a one that becomes a partner of Paul. They have disputes and reconcile, but Paul and Barnabas will be together later. But it was Barnabas who I obviously had good standing in Jerusalem, who in verse 37 is revealed to have brought him, that is Saul, to the apostles, and he interpreted Paul's experience. He was the voice that people listened to and followed. And so he explained Paul's experience on the road to Damascus and what happened there with the encounter with God, and how he now was speaking boldly for Christ rather than against him. And in verse 28, Saul was coming and going with them in Jerusalem. So apparently he gained favor with the people as a result of the witness and the confirmation by Barnabas. And he was speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. And he was in conversation and debate with the Hellenistic Jews. But they still tried to kill him. They wanted Saul silenced because he now was for them a turncoat. He was a person who had completely gone against what they knew him to do. Well, it says when the brothers found out, verse 30, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Now, I would assume that means those who are brothers in the faith wanted to protect him, and so they sent him home for a period of time. You know that he is called for a 3-year journey respite in Arabian desert, where he goes to school and God trains him in the way of the Christian faith. And we'll see that as it unfolds as well. So he went back home where he found a safe place. It would be an interesting study to know when he went back home what people thought about it. So, verse 31 says that it describes in Saul's absence what is happening in the region where he spoke. So, the church throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, that is the region really where Jesus ministered on the west side of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, that region up and down there. Uh, the church began to grow there, to strengthen. They were no longer living in the fear of the apostle Paul or Saul or the enemies of the Jewish, but they lived in the fear of the Lord and were encouraged by what occurred on Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came as our partner to walk alongside of us. the numbers increased as a result. And then we find that Peter makes this brief appearance in verse 32. As Peter was traveling from place to place, he also came down to the saints who lived in Lydda. Lydda and Joppa both were on the Mediterranean coast. Near one another, two events occurred: Ananias and also the raising of Dorcas. But as Peter was preaching, he was also healing. Verse 33 reminds us the two names, not to get confused. Ananias is the one who laid hands on Saul. Ananias is the man that you see in the picture that is the graphic of what Ananias may have looked like. Here was a man who had been bedridden for 8 years, and Peter comes and brings him health. Jesus heals him, and he makes note of this. Two things about two events. Both of these events, Peter distanced himself from the actual healing. Verse 34 reveals that. Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. Now, I'm sure that Aeneas, who had been unable to walk these 8 years, was overwhelmed to get up and to go in his own strength. Now, unlike a teenager who resists making up his bed, I have a notion that Aeneas was delighted to make up his bed because he had been healed. And all of these lived in Lydda and Sharon, and they saw what took place. They saw this miracle and they turned to the Lord. Now, a short distance away in the city of Joppa, there's a woman by the name of Tabitha, who's also Dorcas is her name in Greek. A woman who apparently did so many good things, good works, and acts of charity. Good works flows out of our relationship to Christ. Good works do not bring us into a relationship with Christ. We can be without Christ and do good works as long as we care for. We can be altruistic and make a name for ourselves, but that is not what saves us. When we come to Christ, as Ephesians 2 reminds us, it is out of that conversion experience that our good works flow in order to improve the world, but also to glorify Christ. But here was a woman out of that relationship with Christ, her good works had been benefited all the people around her. They knew her. They wanted something good for her, and something terrible had happened. She got sick and died, according to verse 37. Those who are part of Jewish customs to carefully and respectfully care for the body had washed her in preparation for burial, and she was placed in a room upstairs. And it was to this room that Peter was called from Lydda, which was near Joppa. Unlike the time when Jesus was called because Lazarus was so sick and died, he delayed. Apparently, Peter did not delay. He came as quickly as possible, and each of them had they each had a different purpose in hurrying up or delaying, and that's something. If you want to look in the 11th chapter of John, you can discover why Jesus delayed. But here, he apparently moved quickly from Lydda to Joppa, went up into the room where she was, And then he asked everybody else to leave that room. And so they led him upstairs, and all the widows approached him there, weeping and showing him the evidence of this woman's work, what she had done for that community. I was a little slow in showing my arrows, but I'll work through those and finally get to this one. She was there, and they demonstrated how important that Tabitha or Dorcas was to the community. Then you see, I think, a telling thing about what Peter was all about. Just as he said to the Ananias, it is Jesus who heals you. Peter asked everybody to leave the room. Peter did not want any recognition or connection. He was just the instrument that God used. So everybody left the room. He knelt down and prayed, turning toward the body. Obviously, he acknowledged that she was dead. And he says, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes and saw Peter and sat up. And so this is again Peter making his last major appearance in the book of Acts. In verse 41 says, he gave her his hand and helped her stand up. He called the saints and the widows and presented her alive. She's come on back in the room. Something has happened. And so they, I'm sure, asked the question, how did you do this? And of course, he wanted no attention for himself. He simply wanted the glory to go to God. And this goes on, obviously, throughout Joppa. We know Joppa, that coastal town, has appeared in the Bible and other places, and will appear again as a major part of the expansion of the church. And it was here that Peter stayed for some time in Joppa with Simon the tanner. That would not be a 5-star hotel. It was a smelly business and a somewhat a nasty kind of business to be a tanner because of the chemicals and how they got those chemicals, and the process was not something very pleasant. So Simon, I'm sure, was honored to have Peter there, but Peter probably had to hold his nose a lot of the time he was there. But he stayed there for a while. Now we move to the focus. Now, this is the background for those of you who are teaching from this 9th chapter, but you'll be focusing on this text and two more. This is the encounter, the calling, the place of calling. Again, places and people are important in the Bible. Likely you remember the place you were when you came to know Christ. Maybe you remember the people who were there. Maybe the person that told you about Christ. Well, I think places and people are important in our life. And then we were reminded in the text that Paul was traveling for the purpose of destroying Christians, and he got near his destination, which was Damascus. And when he came near that, that's when God out of heavens brought a light, and Saul saw that light. It flashed around him, and he fell to the ground. Verse 4, he heard a voice, and it said to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And of course, I'm sure Paul was alarmed and frightened at that. And so that voice he heard was one that was startling him, but carried on the conversation. And Saul asked the question, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I am Jesus." Now, this is where he is identified. Jesus identifies that he is the one that is being persecuted, and it identifies the reason that we do what we do. Jesus is the main reason. He is, as we say at Christmas, the reason for the season. He is the one who brings reason to your life and mine. He is the one who is my Savior. He is my Lord. He is the one that I worship. He is the one that I am obedient to. All of these things are important. And so we need to identify what our faith comes from or where our faith comes from. And it is the life and ministry of Jesus. He is the one who is the answer to the questions that are in our world. He is not someone that we can force on someone else. A person has to have the same encounter that Paul did, where one realizes that this is the Son of God, the Savior of the world. Again, we are reminded that those around him, when they heard that voice saying and identifying himself as Jesus, and then they stood speechless, those around him, hearing a sound but seeing no one. I assure you that whenever a person's life changes, there may be people like these people who hear a sound but not see anything. And when they see the evidence of what has taken place in a person's life by their behavior, they take note of that. They take note of who we are, and they see the change in our life. But then we're told that Paul or Saul got off up from the ground. Though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. We know many people who have eyes that are open, and just like Paul, they see nothing spiritually. And it's only whenever we have that encounter with Jesus Christ that we fully comprehend those things that are hidden from our vision prior to coming to Christ. So the men who assisted him took him by the hand and led him on to Damascus. And he was there 3 days, unable to see. He could not drink, or he did not drink or eat. He fasted during that time. And then working on the other side, God is working in the life of Ananias, who received a voice or vision from God. And God spoke to him as he spoke to many in that day. Ananias responded, and he is given the instruction in verse 11. He said, "Get up and get up and go to the street called Straight." Now, we encountered that earlier. And he said, if you go to the street, and obviously Ananias was familiar with that street. I'm not sure who Judas was, but I would believe he was a follower of Christ, a disciple, a person of the way. And he said, go to his house, knock on the door, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, since he is praying there. And God had been working on Saul because verse 12 tells us in a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias coming in, placing his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. So God spoke to both of them. As a result, they each knew that something special was happening. And this is the identification or the purpose for this narrative and this story. It's taken a while for us to get here, but in verse 13, Lord, Ananias answered, and I have heard from many people about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints. Ananias was working still out of his misunderstanding or lack of understanding, out of fear. He had not fully come to understand that God was doing something special through him. And so he continued to resist, and I would have too. To known here a man who's coming to kill me, you are now asking me to go to him uh, for a purpose that I don't fully understand. Verse 14 reveals further how Ananias was still not understanding. He says in verse 13, that is Ananias speaking, and he has authority here from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. And Ananias was the subject or the target of Saul, and now he's asked to go and be a friend to a man who is his enemy. And then in verse 15, I guess we would say is the cornerstone, the thing that brings this whole encounter into full focus. He says, but the Lord said to him, the Lord speaking to Ananias, go, for this man is my chosen instrument to take my name to Gentiles, kings, and Israelites. In that moment, he came to understand that the fulfillment of God's purpose in spreading the gospel is to use an unlikely character named Saul, who was transformed by a conversion experience. His life completely changed. He now was no longer the enemy, but he was a friend because they now were brothers in Christ. And as a result, this is how God is using Saul and Paul to be the purpose and plan of spreading the gospel. But he says even his conversion and what I've called him to do is not without a price. Verse 16, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. It was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who said, whenever we answer the call to follow God, he calls us to come and die. We know that spiritually we die to self and raised in a life of Christ that puts others first. And many have followed him, and as a result, they have paid a supreme price, as did Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he chose to follow Christ. He was called upon, as was other members of his family. I think he and two of his brother-in-laws died by hanging on the same day in Nazi Germany. We're called to follow him. So when you answer that call, realize that it is a call to follow faithfully. It's not an easy task, and any task that is worthwhile is a difficult task, and that's what we're called on to do. I don't have this in this lesson, but I will in some others to show you how I use what I call the to go box. Most of us, when we go out as husband and wife to a restaurant, the man will eat all of his food, but the woman generally will want a to go box. We used to call them doggy bags until people caught on to the fact that most people who asked for doggy bags didn't have dogs. So now we call them to go boxes. Well, I think we ought to find something in this story that we can take home with us and apply in our life. I'll let you marinate that thought, and I'll show you how we use the to go box in further lessons. Thank you for listening and taking this part of the journey with me. And there are more journeys to come, exciting journeys to come. Thank you again and take care.